Welcome, Rob. I'm so happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Appreciate you having me, and I'm really grateful to be here and excited to chat with you and the listeners.
Oh, fantastic. Me too. I first just want to start with kind of what drew you to the work you're doing now through Humans First.
Yeah, so I would call the area of study that I do technology mindfulness, and that's something that I kind of came up with. It's not like a common term, right? But I went through high school, and I had a very difficult time during high school because I developed extremely bad acne. And so what happened as a result of that is I had very low self-esteem and self-worth, and that was a very difficult time for me to connect with people and just relate to people in general. And even one year for my yearbook picture, I purposefully didn't go because I just didn't want people to remember my face that way. But as a result of this acne, I also developed an addiction to video games. But this was in the mid 90s before most people even had a cell phone or had an internet connected computer. And so I saw before many people were even using technology, what were the negative impacts or repercussions of technology in my own life. And then at other points in my life, I also was addicted to Facebook and addicted to email. And so I've kind of had this, like you were saying before, a love hate relationship with technology where it can do amazing things, but it can also be we can also use it in ways that are kind of harmful. And so my mission at Humans First, my company, is to help humanity understand how technology impacts mental health, relationships, and productivity at work. And I truly believe that if all 4.2 billion people connected to the internet knew what I know about how technology impacts humanity, the world would be a completely different place. And that's why I'm excited to share this information with people.
Yeah, it's so true. And yeah, I also have a love-hate relationship with technology. And the thing is, when I'm talking to people, and because I'm older, I do workshops, so I have a lot of very young people in the workshops. And I
Mm.
know that their first assumption or bias is that, oh, I don't get it because I'm quote old. And I can't justify by saying, no, it's because I'm older, I get it. But it's I think I was the first person in my sphere of people, whatever that was back in the 90s, that actually bought a personal computer. I think
Mm.
there's so much good that can come out of technology. So the problem from my perspective is not the technology, it's mindless use, and it's the intention of the companies behind the technology that users are not understanding. And so I really want to hear what you think about this. There's so many things, the addictiveness of it and people not recognizing that it's designed that way, the loss of productivity and just the waste of life, as far as the amount of time we're spending doing things on those little devices versus interacting with other people, which again, I know is a lot of your focus with Humans First. But kind of just give me what your general thoughts are about this, the direction we're heading and what you think about the impact is on us.
Yeah, so I just want to be clear to the listeners and to you, right? So I'm not anti-technology. I'm pro-humanity. That's how I describe myself. And I am a nerd. I built my first computer in middle school, so I love technology. But I view technology as a tool, right? And just like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. So, for instance, I can take a hammer and build a house, or I can take a hammer and hit you on the head. It's not the hammer that's bad; it's how I use it, right? And so, I kind of think of technology as the same way. And here's kind of a quick exercise that I give for workshops or people that I'm working with. I say to people, just take 10 seconds. It shouldn't take long. Think about the happiest moment in your life, right? Whatever that is. I'll give you just a few seconds to think about it. And so when I ask people that question, a lot of times a couple general themes come up, no matter who they are. The themes are that happiest moment generally is an experience and not related to a material good or object. And then the other thing is that that experience involves people, right? Usually the people in their life that they care about. And so when you think about that, none of those things have to do with technology, right? And I think very few people are ever going to be on their deathbed and wondering to themselves, "Oh man, what if I had spent more time with technology?" Instead, they're going to be wondering to themselves, "Man, I wish or I wanted to have spent more time with the people I cared about." And so, the reason that I named my company Humans First is in America, and this is a pre-COVID statistic. This is not, you cannot say that COVID affected this. In America, we spend on average 12 hours and 21 minutes a day in front of screens and media. And so, unfortunately, humans are not first in our life anymore. Technology is first based on how we spend our time. And so the name of my company, Humans First, is a reminder to people that the most love and joy and meaning and purpose in our lives comes from being with and connecting with other people, not technology.
It's so true. And I have to say, I am shocked. Now, I have to disclose, I use technology every day. I'm using it right now, right? I
Me
think there are
too.
a lot of, great things about technology, and I use it all the time. But I do not use social media. It is such a rare thing. The company does, but I don't do it because the
Hmm.
amount of time it takes versus the payoff is not worth it for me. But I understand in today's times we need to be on social media, right? We try to
Hmm.
use it mindfully, but I don't use social media. And I know I drive even my friends crazy because I also half the time don't know where my phone is. Like, they'll say, I've been calling you for, 2 hours. I'm like, I don't know where the phone is. I'll have to go find it. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it's just not prominent in my life. It's a
Mm.
necessary tool for work and for, connecting with friends or whatever. But I'm connecting with them to, I don't know, determine a date or where we're going to meet. You know what I mean? I'm not
Hmm.
using it to be the sole source of our relationship. And it disturbs me when I go out to lunch or out to dinner and I walk in. Now, most of my friends know if they leave their phone out, I'm going to get irritated, right? I don't want to hear, I don't have any notifications on except for phone, text, and calendar. That's it. All the other
Nice.
notifications are off. So I
Nice.
can't stand being interrupted.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, when you walk into a restaurant, there are couples or families, and everybody, even though you're so tight at a restaurant table, they're all looking
Yeah.
down at their phones instead of at each
Mhm.
other. So, what do you think the impact is? Or, I mean, I'm going to ask you a question you can't possibly say for sure, but I'm curious about the long term impact on relationships with us putting that device between us instead of just connecting directly.
Oh, so I'll give you a couple different pieces of information that I think are very relevant. So these researchers, these psychologists, did a study on what happens when a smartphone is present. And so here's what they found: if let's say you and I are at a dinner table, even if I put my smartphone face down and turned off between us, right? Like it's still visible, the feelings of trust, closeness, and connection are reduced between us, even if it's turned off and face down, right? And so what's happening is and this is all like subconscious, right? It's not like you don't like this probably doesn't enter your mind, but like when this device is in front of you, you are devoting, I'll just call it brain cycles, to thinking about what could be in this device, or do I have to check it? Who's trying to get a hold of me, right? Like you're subconsciously thinking that. And so that takes me out of the present and out of the conversation with you. So that is already proven, like that's not, a debate, right? But think about how many millions of people that's impacting, around the world when they, have a cell phone out on the dinner table. But here's another thing that is really interesting that I think has far more implications for honestly the 4.2 billion people connected to the internet. So I'm sure as a psychologist, you're aware that when you connect with people in person, chemicals that are released are serotonin and oxytocin. And those are the chemicals that make us feel loved and needed and wanted and supported, right? And warm human touch and in-person connection releases the most serotonin and oxytocin. Well, as you go toward more digital ways of communicating like email and text, less serotonin and less oxytocin are released. And so our feelings of social support and care and love are less, they're diminished when we use digital communication. And so one of the main ways that humans deal with stress is our social support system, our feeling of, being cared for by other people, like our family or close friends. Well, I truly believe that one of the main reasons, one of the main contributors to the mental health crisis today is that because almost all our communication is going digital and almost nothing is in person anymore, there's less serotonin and oxytocin released in our relationships, and therefore we have a less perceived social support, which means that we are less able to tolerate or deal with stress. And I think that this is a huge contributor to what's happening to our mental health crisis. I really believe that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I would agree. I think well, I hoped that one thing people would see out of the pandemic shutdowns is what happens when you can't connect personally. And of course,
Mhm.
it did have a huge mental health impact, but I'm not seeing a decrease in usage now. So I'm assuming
Right.
that lesson didn't quite translate. Um, well, there's so many aspects to this, it's hard to even narrow it down. But
There is,
what,
yeah.
and my listeners know, anytime I get on this topic of technology, it's like, oh, but one of the things that I wonder about, so I know for me, there's a tremendous social pressure to use it or to
Mhm.
be on social media
Mm.
specifically, for example.
Mhm.
And if you're not, it's assumed there's something wrong with you, right? Like, why aren't you on Facebook? Why aren't you on Instagram? Why aren't you on TikTok? Like all of those things. And now it's easy for me to say, and again, probably because I'm older and I'm confident in what I'm doing, and I have the science behind it to understand why it's not the healthiest thing for me. But I think there's a lot of people that maybe do feel that, like especially younger people, peer pressure. Like if they're not on, then how are they going to connect with all the other people that are on? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that as far as the impact on young people that are on it all the time, but also those that are feeling that peer pressure and they don't necessarily want to be on it.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? I wrote a blog post entitled 8 Reasons Why Social Media is the Cigarette of the 21st Century. And I truly, like, this is one of the most strongly held beliefs I have about all this entire technology mindfulness topic. I truly believe that in 20 years, we're going to say to ourselves, what on earth were we thinking giving 12-year-olds a cell phone with unlimited use to social media? That's totally bonkers. It doesn't even make any sense, but we just don't realize it right now how terrible it really is for people psychologically. And so what's interesting about social media is people experience FOMO, or a fear of missing out, when they're on it. But then I also agree with what you just said. They experience FOMO when they're off it, right? Because they're like, well, if I'm not on social media, I feel like I'm missing out on those things. And I guess the thing that I would say to people is you just have to realize that you're not missing out on things. You just have to think differently about how you communicate with people. So, in this day and age, there's just a unlimited number of ways to connect with people, right? Even just, let's say, text message, which, isn't as fancy as social media. There's not, it's harder to do photos and everything, but you can still do it. And but what I would really say is, instead of social media, why don't you actually go back to what we used to do, like call people or see them in person? Because you will develop a much better relationship with people that way. And here's kind of the challenge that I offer people. In America, the average person spends 2 hours and 14 minutes a day on social media. And if you're younger, it's probably way greater, right? Like probably 4 to 5 hours for a lot of young people. And so what I suggest, or I guess the challenge I give to people, is this: let's just pretend for a second that you cut your time in half. I'm not saying you get rid of social media. I'm just saying you cut your social media time in half, and then take that time that you spent, that you can now have free, and spend that with people either in person or on the phone. How much better your relationships will be, and how much happier you are, and how much more fulfillment you will get out of your life is so much greater. It just takes slightly more effort, and it isn't as convenient as social media, but that's okay. It still is such a great, amazingly different change to your life, and it's so positive. I really have found that to be helpful for me.
Yeah. I mean, it may not be as convenient, but it's much more valuable. And,
Mhm.
there's a trade-off there. Um, I know that you have talked about this before, but maybe just so they don't hear, so my listeners don't keep hearing me say sort of the same thing. But can you talk a little bit about the addictiveness of especially the social media platforms, or at least some of them?
Yeah, well, think about this, right? So I think in order to understand this, the listeners really have to understand what is the business model of the social media companies, or any media company. It's not just social media, it's actually all news media companies, right? The business model is this: I want to show you as much anger inducing, fear inducing, or anxiety inducing content as possible, because it maximizes your time on my platform. The more time of yours that I get or maximize on the platform, the more advertising dollars I can get, and the more money I make. And the reason, if I'm Facebook, that I want to, for instance, show you negative or anger inducing content in humans, we have a negativity bias, as I'm sure you know. And so we pay much closer attention to negative information than positive because it's a survival mechanism. And so it's not a surprise that negative information gets more eyeballs, keeps more people on platforms longer, and makes the social media companies more money. So think about it. You are essentially being put into a negative mindset or a negative emotional state because that makes more money off of your time and attention, and that is why the Facebook is showing you that information. So now that you know that the Facebook's main goal is to monopolize your time and attention, think about this. So what Mark Zuckerberg and all the other social media companies do is they hire tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of engineers to figure out, using their knowledge, but also supercomputers, how to monopolize your time and attention as much as possible. And so how is one single human brain going to possibly resist the efforts of tens of thousands of engineers and supercomputers that is trying to make something very addicting? The answer is it's not. Your brain isn't. It's just not a winning battle that you can really expect to reasonably come out ahead on. And so for me, the solution that I've chosen is to delete social media completely from my phone, not delete my accounts, but what I have to do then to use social media is to use it only on my computer or laptop, which forces me to be much more intentional or mindful about its use. And I still get the benefits, but I'm not so inclined to just look at it all the time when I'm on my phone.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't have it on my phone either anymore. I took it off a few years ago. And part of it is, and it goes back to this addictive quality, I think, but I've known for a long time. And even before I knew, before there were real studies, there were there was anecdotal information that caught my attention. Like, this makes sense. I don't think I want to go down this rabbit hole. And,
Yeah.
and so I thought I was exempt. Like, I don't check my phone 200 times a day, whatever the numbers were at the time. And
Yeah.
and then discovered, yes, I did. I was at a writer's retreat with no internet access, and I kept picking up my phone. And that's when I realized, like,
Uh,
oh my gosh.
mhm.
So that's when I came home, took it all off my phone. I occasionally go in. I have accounts too. I occasionally go in my personal accounts, but only on the computer,
Yep.
and never if I'm working, because oh my gosh, the productivity sap that
Mhm.
happens once you start
It's
is
unbelievable.
it's amazing how much time people, I mean, and I do a lot of, again, workshops, and I'm working with teams that are complaining they don't have enough time to get their work done. And so the minute I start to go down this avenue of, well, how much are you using your phone during the day? How many times are you checking your social media? I mean, there's a lot of resistance to it, and I understand it, but it's
Mhm.
like you really have to be in control, not just because of the time, but because of the addictiveness. So
Mhm.
we get a hit of dopamine, right? When we get a
Mhm.
like or somebody says something positive, whereas we also go down the stress response path when somebody says something awful. But
Mhm.
that little hit is so powerful, which I think people underestimate. I don't even read our reviews of workshops. I have staff do it. I don't ever want the feedback directly that I see, like, oh, it was great, because I don't want to base what I'm doing on that feedback, because it's
Uh,
a drug, right? It's
uh-huh.
a it's a hit of, oh, I feel good now. I want it to be realistic, and I want them to give me the feedback that's constructive, but I don't read the actual, people say lovely comments. I have my staff read it so that I don't go down that path even without the technology. So
Uh-huh.
how do you counteract it, or what do you think you can do to counteract it other than minimizing your exposure to it? Because that's been obviously my path, but
Well, I mean, there's so many there's so many ways to answer that question, but I think what you really have to ask yourself is what is important to you in your life? Because again, let's say you're using social media 5 hours a day, right? Again, that's probably a
okay.
pretty average young person. That's literally almost a full-time job. That's 7 days a week, 5 hours a day. That's 35 hours a week, literally almost a full-time job. And so you have to ask yourself, I mean, is making Mark Zuckerberg more rich really that important to you? Is that really what is, you're here to do? If you think about humans, right? I think a lot about how did humans exist 50,000 years ago when we were cavemen and cavewomen. There was main things that humans did. We hunted, we gathered, and we socialized. And 90% of our time as cavemen and cavewomen was spent socializing with other people, right? And that ratio is almost exactly flipped today. Now we're spending close to 90% of our waking hours with technology. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, like, well, certain, almost anything in our life as a species has to help us with one or two things: help us survive or help us reproduce. Technology doesn't inherently do either one of those things, right? And so it makes logical sense that if we're doing this thing for almost the entire day that doesn't inherently help us as a species, that's probably going to have some negative repercussions over the long term. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term it probably will. And so, like, these are the kind of things that I'm just trying to help people to start thinking about and be aware of, because if you don't have awareness of these things, you can't change your behavior. And so the main thing I think you can start doing is to educate yourself about these things. And that's why a big component of what Humans First does is just simply educate people on these things, because most people, they're not thinking about these things and they're not obsessed with them like I am, which is fine. They don't have to be, but that's why I really want to share this information with people so that they can start being aware.
Yeah, and that's the whole key with mindfulness in anything that we do. And that's what I was saying at the beginning is I just think people they're not being aware. They're not recognizing, because there are bigger ramifications even now with the misinformation that's rampant in technology, and now that the
Mhm.
AI stuff that's happening, the what are they, deep fakes, where you don't
Yeah,
even know if the person you're looking at online is
real.
that person or somebody else because they've gotten so sophisticated. And so it's not a matter of, again, never going on your device or never going on the internet. We all do all the time, but it's a matter of being very aware, or even I always enter it a little bit skeptical, like,
Mhm.
where's the source, or where is this coming from, because we
Yeah.
don't know anymore. And I think that's another thing that's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around.
Hmm.
It started out innocently enough maybe, but they now don't realize that there are a lot of people who have malcontent. Their their intentions are not to make the world a better place or to help an individual. It's to gain something for themselves only. And we just have to be realistic about it and pay attention. But it's
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that, right? So there's an author called Win, and he wrote a 40-page white paper on Twitter and like the gamification of Twitter. And he's like an expert in echo chambers and the gamification of things, or game theory. And what he basically concluded is that Twitter and other social media platforms are essentially the most ideal environment to create a cult of people that, and obviously some cults can be positive, but a lot of cults are have negative ramifications. And he basically showed that, like, this is like the ultimate tool that can be used. And a lot of this unfortunately happens for like a lot of political issues, right? And again, like,
yes.
I don't, just to be clear, I don't affiliate with any particular political party. So, like, I don't have a horse in that race, but it's just more the fact that, there are people being manipulated into believing some political stance, again, one way or the other on the aisle, doesn't matter, that is probably not true or is based on false information. And these social media platforms are the perfect tool to do that. And so, again, like, I wish every person on earth knew that, because then way less of them would probably be susceptible to falling into those echo chambers. But that's not, what's unfortunately what is happening. A lot of people are getting sucked in.
No, I agree with that. And it's again another example that, as you mentioned earlier, that's not just social media, it's all news platforms. So we don't really get unbiased news hardly anywhere anymore. You have to
Hmm.
really be mindful about the information that you're consuming and not
Hmm.
just get sucked into something. And it's really easy to do it because, like you said, they're very skilled at this. The technology is such, and the psychologists and engineers behind it. And these companies also hire lots of psychologists, not just the engineers that are programming, because
Right.
they really are tying it to our intrinsic behavior and the brain chemicals that we have no control over, that happen instantaneously, and they're taking advantage of it a lot of times. But it's
Hmm.
just, I don't know, it's just the craziest thing I've ever. I'm amazed every week at something I see or hear and think, why are we going down this road? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me sometimes. Um,
Agreed.
I know another area that, because you do work a lot with productivity, improving productivity. So there are obvious things we can change about technology, which we can talk about in a minute for productivity. But I know you're also a proponent of the 4-day work week. So I was wondering
Yeah.
if you could tell me, what are the benefits of that?
Yeah, so my consultancy helps entire companies transition from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week with no loss in productivity or profitability. And just to be clear, when I say a 4-day work week, I mean 4 8-hour days, not 4 10-hour days. And so we're not, like every person in the company, management included, gets a full day of time back. And so you might think to yourself, like, the common two questions are, well, like, how can this be possible? How can I do 5 days of work in 4 days? And then what about like my clients? They need 5 days of coverage. And, really, if you think about what's happening in the modern workday, the average white collar worker sends and receives 126 emails, and then they check their emails in Slack once every 6 minutes. And by the way, so if you're doing 126 emails a day and you take 2 minutes per email, that's literally 4 hours of your day right there. Then if you layer in a couple hours of meetings, that's 6 hours of your day. You only have 2 hours left to do your job. I mean, that's not realistic for most people. So it really is possible to reduce some email and reduce meetings and, get all this time back. And there's just some incredible benefits that companies can experience. So turnover goes way down, so you have way lower recruiting costs. Employee engagement and happiness goes way up. Then you have the ultimate recruiting tool, right? Less than 1% of US companies are offering this. And so if you have this insane employee benefit that less than 1% of companies offer, you can retain and attract the most rock star employees in your industry. And so what does that do to the value of your company? That makes it exponentially bigger, right? But the other thing is, people also don't think that profitability can go up, but uh, um, one of the most famous cases is Andrew Barnes took a 240 person financial services company in 2018, and he took it to a 4-day work week, and profit per employee increased 14.5%. And so, I mean, a lot of people hear this and they almost think it's too good to be true, right? Like, what, like, how is this possible? But it really is. You just have to have a little bit of an open mind and be willing to change how you're doing some things, but it really isn't that hard.
Yeah, well, and I find it ironic that all we heard for decades was technology was going to save us time and we wouldn't have to work as much. And instead, it's the technology that's extending our work hours. And so I
Yes.
I totally agree. When I do a couple of things. I'm a productivity freak, I know, but I'm very regimented. I'm very relaxed and free will outside of work, but with work, it's very regimented. So everything's on my
Yeah.
calendar. I check my emails at certain times of the day. I
Love
have
it.
breaks in my calendar. I have movement breaks in my calendar, so I don't sit too long. So everything is scheduled, and then when that schedule's done,
Nice.
I'm done, right? But what I found when I first switched, at first I was just working like I've always worked and checking email throughout the day, and I started really
Oh.
focusing on this interruption problem and how long it would
Hmm.
take me to get back on track. And so when I got very regimented, and you have to let people know when you're making a big change, and it was like, you can email me. And this goes back to also this instant gratification thing with texts and
Hmm.
emails and social media. It's like, I do remember the day where, we could go hours without communicating with someone else. And so I'm like, no, I'm going to check it at 8 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock. So if you email me, I'll get back to you, but it may be a while. But what happened is I was working maybe 5:30 in the morning till 5:30 in the evening every day.
Mm.
And when I made this switch, it dropped to like at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was done. I'd finished
Yes.
my work, right? And so that was like
Yeah.
there was my big motivation to, okay, I have to stick with this, because what's happening
Yeah.
is the diversions and the emails and the text messages and everybody wanting something right now was preventing me from really, and especially my work. I'm writing, it's creativity, it's research. Every time you get interrupted, you're starting over from scratch, basically, right? You got to go back to
Yep.
something you've already done and get that momentum back. So I can see why a 4-day work week would work if you set it up right. I mean, that's really all it comes down to, you boundaries and processes.
Yeah, I'd love to put some numbers to exactly what you just said. And by the way, I'm like super impressed with you, Teresa. And it sounds like you're already doing a lot of the things that I would advocate for a normal, like an average person. So I think that's really cool that you've come to that conclusion.
The
What
hard
and
way.
and I was the same way, right? Like I thought I was super productive, but I would get to the end of a day and I would say to myself, like, what did I really accomplish? And the list that I could write of things I accomplished was very small, very small. And so here's what's happening, right? Researchers did some research on when people get in flow, right? When you're just having it like in this amazingly productive state, you can be up to 500% more productive. So 2 hours in flow is better than an entire day without flow, right? So, but here's the problem. When people are in flow and they get interrupted, and that could be something by as simple as a phone call or an email, when they get interrupted, it takes them 26 minutes to get back into flow. Well, we check our email and Slack once every 6 minutes on average and get a smartphone notification once every 15 minutes on average. So you can see that the average person is never, ever in flow. They're never getting into this flow state where they're 500% more productive. And so if you can block off just 2 or 3 hours of your day and eliminate all distractions, and I'm saying like everything, which is easier said than done, but it really isn't that hard, then you can get into this flow state and literally get more done in 2 hours than an entire day before and work actually less than 4 days a week. Like you're saying, you cut about, sounds like you cut about 3 hours per day off.
Yeah,
That times 5 days a week, that's 15 hours. That's 2 work days, right?
right. Right.
That's
Yeah.
that's exactly what's possible.
Back when I read Tim Ferriss's book, The 4 Day Work Week, is the first time I had come up with or seen this concept. And I was like, is that possible? Is that possible? I started really looking at things. I was like, and then of course it took me a while to get around to doing it. Cause like many people, first I read a great idea and then I set it aside. But yeah, it makes a huge difference. And the quality of work. Um, I know for me and for my staff, I think I can speak for them too. And they're younger. What happens when you're trying to really say flesh out an idea, or this is true with a lot of our leaders that we coach. They've got to, it could be something like trying to develop the next year's budget or the strategic plan. There's a lot of different processes happening in the mind, right? Trying to keep track of all the moving parts, evaluate the past, look at the future, and something as simple as a stupid notification on the phone going off, because I challenge anyone to not, at least for one split second, look over to see what that was, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
then, so like you said, you set yourself back 26 minutes. Well, if you if you do that 5 times in a day, your accomplishment list is not going to be very long because you can't finish, or you kind of then go, okay, whatever, and you rush through because it's due, but it's not necessarily a quality product that you end up with at the end. And I think I can't say his name, the psychologist that wrote the book Flow, but when you're in that state of flow, which is a psychological state, it is time stops. Like, it doesn't
Mhm.
even exist anymore. When I'm writing, I'm working on a book right now. When I'm writing and can get
Nice.
into flow, now I will end up maybe working for 10 hours, but it feels like two. But it's
Yes.
joyful work. It's like, oh, I nailed that. I got that. You know what I mean? And you just keep going and going. And I think so many people aren't experiencing that ever. And that's part
No.
of why employee engagement is so low, because there's like, gotta go to work. And, there's no meaning in it because it just feels like you're hopping all day and you're not kind of delving into something worthwhile. But
Yeah, and it's really interesting you say that. So, two quick comments. The first one is the reason that I have come to these conclusions about how to structure technology use in a way that's helpful is I probably should have mentioned this earlier. I have ADHD, right? And so it's way easier for me than the average person to get distracted. And so I realized that I was getting distracted all the time, and it was happening so often that I was like, oh my God, this is really hard to, for me to accomplish anything. So the good news is that if a guy with ADHD, can, structure my tech use in a way that is helpful to me, that makes my life easier instead of harder, anybody can do it, right? And so I've run hundreds and hundreds of experiments over the last few years to, try different things and techniques and ways to structure my tech use in order to come to the conclusions that I have today, which is, I feel like that's pretty helpful. But what another thing that's interesting that you brought up is, people, when researchers look at what, if they ask people, if did you have a good day at work today, And people say yes. The number one thing most highly correlated with yes, I had a good day at work was making meaningful progress in something that matters. And so if you are constantly interrupted by everything, right? Email, Slack, phone, you're really not making probably much meaningful progress in something that's, important. And so by it seems very counterintuitive, but by single tasking, eliminating distractions, and focusing, not only do you have a higher quality product, you get more done, but you're actually happier at work and you feel more fulfilled because you're making meaningful progress in something. It's such a win. It is such a
Yeah.
win.
Yeah. No, I'm always fascinated with it because we think we don't have any control over our mind, and we don't always recognize the connection between what our mind is doing and our level of happiness. But it's once you hit it, and I'm going to ask you this question because I know time flies. I'm going to ask you a question about this in just a moment, but I wanted to say this is a good example of what I'm hearing a lot now, which is people that are now still working from home and they're
Yep.
having a terrible time with distractions. So whether
Yeah.
somebody else lives at the house or whatever's going on, and so I just want to share that, and this is kind of a use of technology, but
Mhm.
I got so tired of people coming. I am in a separate room. I had to do that during the pandemic, move out of the house because I got interrupted too much. But
Yeah.
I'm in a separate room, but then they come to the door and they'll like do this at the glass, right? Put their hands up and look in the glass, which is just as distracting as if they just came in. So I ended up ordering a light, and I ordered a little adapter that makes the light remote controlled. And it's
Nice.
it's out there. And every time, like now, I just click the light on, and everyone now understands if the light is on, do not come near the door. And all technology is off that I'm not using. And that allows
Mm.
me to focus on you. It allows me to focus on, what I'm thinking of. So I just wanted to throw in one positive technology thing that can help. And especially if you're working at home and struggling with this. So
Love that. Yeah, I mean, and you just brought up something that I think is really the root cause of a lot of the problems that people experience is the average company that I talk to, almost none of them have established written standards of communication or communication boundaries. They're not written. Even if you think you have them and you just tell employees something, if they're not written, they don't exist, right? And here's the problem with that is if you do not have written guidelines or boundaries, every person at the company is just forced to guess how, when, and how much they need to communicate. So not only does this guessing, duplicate efforts and make things way less efficient, but it also creates a ton of stress that's unneeded. And so if you communicate this to, the communication boundaries to employees, then they know, oh, for instance, like here's an example of what this might sound like. We believe that business communication should be handled between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. local time. We expect that all business emails will be answered within 24 business hours, and email is generally used for external communication. We believe that Slack is used for mostly internal communication, and that any Slack messages will be answered within 3 business hours. If there's something that requires more urgency than 3 hours, you will Slack call someone else, and we will do our best to return Slack calls as immediately as possible. So imagine if all that was communicated to not only the employees, but the clients of a company. Now, instead of checking your email once every 6 minutes, like the average person does, you can check your email once or twice a day and just respond. And then you have the rest of the day to focus and do whatever it is you need to do. And that is like such a simple step, but almost no company has done that.
no, no, and that's amazing. And again, we're really talking about the same thing, which is not just boundaries, but understanding how the brain works. And those companies are going to have more productive employees if they do that simple thing, right? But
Mhm.
it is hard to communicate it. It's a challenge, and that kind of brings me to what I said I was going to ask you, which is if an individual, regardless of whether it's they work for a company or they own a company or whatever it is, but if an individual is recognizing that they might be overwhelmed with technology, I'm a big proponent of baby steps, like starting small so that the change sticks and then you can keep building on it. So, could you give our listeners maybe a couple, three baby steps that they could take starting today, like right after they listen to this, to start lessening that overwhelm and getting more control back over their time and productivity and their mental health?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, three super easy things, and each one of these will take a couple minutes. The first one that you can do is, if especially if you have an iPhone, the setting is called raise to wake. You can disable the raise to wake setting. And what that setting does is when you pick up your phone and physically move it, it automatically turns on the display so that you can see whatever it is on the display. So if you turn that feature off, not only does it save battery life, which most people want that, but the other thing is then your phone screen doesn't automatically turn on. You either have to double tap the display or hit the power button to see what's on it, and it sucks you in your phone way less, way less. And there's a similar setting on Android too. So that to me is like literally you can do that in 20 seconds, and that massive. I found that when I did that, it reduced my screen time by a couple hours a week. Just that one thing right there,
Yeah.
right? Then the next thing would be, I always kind of like to call it spring cleaning for your phone. When you have, it's like so easy to add an app because most apps are, free, but you really don't use a lot of them. And even though it seems like there's not a cost to having the app because it's free, there is a cost because you're overwhelmed with the amount of crap on your phone, right? It would be like trying to find something in a super messy room versus a really clean and organized room. It's just harder in the messy room. And so the second thing that I would recommend to people is just take a few minutes, go through your phone, delete any apps you haven't used in a while. The metric that I kind of use for myself is if I haven't used an app in 3 months, I delete it. And that, has served me pretty well. And it keeps the amount of apps down on my phone. It also saves space and kind of helps your phone run probably a little faster. The third thing that you could do is go to the notifications section of your settings and disable almost all notifications. And like you said earlier, I really love, Teresa, that you said that you've disabled almost everything. The ones that I've disabled all notifications except for phone calls, text messages, and travel apps, just so that I know if my flight's delayed or something. But everything else is not enabled for any kind of notification. And what's interesting is 85% of people have not ever altered their notifications on their phone, which
Oh,
blows my mind. So the vast majority of you listening probably haven't done this, and this will dramatically save the amount of notifications and interruptions that you get from your phone, and it will just be a game changer for you.
that's amazing. 85%. Yeah, I don't even keep now. I'm about to take a trip, so I'll turn on the notifications for my travel apps.
Travel, yeah.
But I keep everything off because you can still go in. I think that's the other thing is the key to me behind all of this is it's not that you never can use any of these wonderful, apps or technology. It's that it's switching it so that you're in charge of when you do it versus it being in charge of when it pulls you in. And so it's not hard to turn those apps on. I mean, the notifications on and off at all. It's just a little
Right.
swipe. And so, yeah, I keep mine off and my phone is on do not disturb half the time. So I
Hmm.
get very few of those kind of interruptions. I still have the human kind, but not the technology kind. So, well, I just want to thank you so much. And if people want to know more about the work that you're doing, is there a website they can go to?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. My website is humansfirst.us. And one other thing that I just wanted to offer the listeners, Teresa, is a free 30-minute consultation call with me. So if people want to redeem that, all they have to do is just email me. My email address is rob at humansfirst.us. And then just mention this podcast in the subject line. And I'm happy to set up a 30-minute call to help you with your technology mindfulness.
Lovely. Oh, that's great. Okay, well, I'll repeat that too in a little while just to make sure they have it. And I just want to thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's so needed, and I hope people listening, even if there's just a little niggle, like, oh, could that be me? Then check it out because you could really greatly improve the quality of your life. I think if you just followed this sort of path of, I don't know, taking advantage of the best of technology, but keeping it within control so that you're in the driver's seat. So I just thank you so much.
Thank you, Teresa. Really appreciate you.